All right. Just waiting on Mr. Calabria. Should be in any second. Just got a note from him. But Rob, welcome to the great state of Ohio.
Glad to be here,
Yeah,
despite the gloomy weather.
it is
But
very gloomy here. I mean, it's been gorgeous in Ohio up until just a few days ago. I mean, high 60s, low 70s, sun, but we're in
you know,
gloom.
I try to visit interesting things along the way when I travel. And I looked at Ohio, and the big thing was Eddie Rickenbacker's birthplace is here in Ohio. But I think I may pass that one up. Hey, Mark.
Mark, how's it going?
Rich, doing well, thanks.
All right. Excellent. We'll give everybody another 30 seconds or so to get logged on, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So
I think we should just get started now.
started now. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get into it. All right.
Our time is valuable too.
Well, welcome to the big picture. I'm Rich Swerbinsky with Onward and Upward Consulting. As always, pleased to be joined by esteemed colleague and co-host today, reporting live from the great state of Ohio, Rob Chrisman. Rob, welcome to Ohio.
Thank you. Thank you.
And
Mark, where are you today?
I'm in Washington, D.C.
And
nation's capital.
This week, very, very pleased to welcome back to the show, very special guest, senior advisor at the Cato Institute, former chief economist to Vice President Pence, former FHFA Director under President Trump's last term. It is Mark Calabria. Mark, welcome back and thank you.
Rich, it's such a pleasure to be back. Seems like it was just yesterday.
We got great feedback on your last appearance. The 45 minutes blew by. And there was just so much more we wanted to get into with you. So thanks for coming back on the show now that we have the election in the rear view. And I'm excited to get into it today.
Yeah, I wanted to. So Mark, you know, and of course, Rich and I want to thank our sponsor, Gaffney Austin. And Rich is going to talk a little bit about that company in terms of public relations. But the first question, Mark, that I wanted to ask you is communication and how that works in whether it's at the FHFA level or the U.S. government level, because there's so much conjecture now. The press is thrown into a tizzy with all of these appointments, which unless we're not going to obey the Constitution, have to be all the cabinet positions, I think, have to be approved by the Senate. How does the FHFA, how does somebody who's directing the FHFA, who has to approve that person, and how does that work, and how does that play into things now?
Great question, Rob. And, I really do emphasize the big point about communications. Maybe I'll just take a moment and note, there's an entire chapter in my book on the importance of communicating with the press and outside stakeholders when you're running an agency, and how important it is to be able to get your message out there and help clear up, I'm going to say, confusion, because again, it's not always transparent how the process works. Now, FHFA, for instance, is now at will. So on inauguration day, in all likelihood, probably 95%, if not 99% chance that the current director will leave on inauguration day, and that the White House will appoint an acting director, likely somebody who's a member of the senior staff. Not long thereafter, I mean, it does take, and having been through a confirmation process, in the FBI, they dig through your background, the political people vet you, so it's a fairly extensive process. My gut would be that, maybe we see an FHFA director nominated April, May. So I think that is a possibility. So again, keep it in mind, from January inauguration day until that person is confirmed, there'll be an acting in place. And it's likely that if we're lucky, maybe an FHFA director is confirmed by the Senate, June, July would be my guess, is kind of what we're looking at. Certainly want to emphasize, wide margin of error. When I was nominated in January 2019, I was confirmed in April. So, but again, most of the work on the background for me was done in 2018. So again, in fact, I'm trying to remember. Yes, the president signed off on my nomination in September 2018 is when he sent the letter that when the recommendation is made by presidential personnel. And then that's FBI, background, all that sort of stuff. So it can take a while. And it's important to keep in mind that even for the names we've seen today, well, many of them for the cabinet positions we've heard of already been people who have been through previous background checks. So that's for starters. They'll have to get updated background checks, and that can certainly take a considerable amount of time and additional vetting. But it does. I mean, it's not a slow process. This is not like you're being hired at a private company. Often takes a considerable amount of time. Almost all of these will require some floor debate and floor vote in the Senate, so there are scheduling issues. Now, for the cabinet itself, most of the president's cabinet will certainly be in place by March. But things like the FHFA director, I recognize that obviously, I served in that position, so I think it's really important. I think it's important to all of us, but it is important to keep in mind that things like FHFA director, CFPB will be a similar process where the current director leaves inauguration day. There's an acting employee put in place who's probably a senior person, or they'll potentially bring somebody in. And the same will be the case at the OCC control of the currency. And it will, again, take a few months. But the reality is, in our world, the financial services stuff, the housing stuff, other than the HUD secretary, which again, we at this point don't know, the other stuff is going to be second tier. And this is stuff where, you're not going to really make a decision permanently on FHFA director until you've chosen a Treasury Secretary, for instance, because they usually are at the table for that conversation. So, Rich, Rob, I hope in a roundabout way that answered the question.
It did. Thank you.
And we've linked Mark's book in the chat. And if you're listening to the podcast, it is called Shelter from the Storm, How a COVID Mortgage Meltdown Was Averted. And you can find it on Amazon and other outlets. So encourage everybody to pick that up and take a stroll through Mark's world during the pandemic. I can only imagine those years for you. As you chronicled a little bit last week, sitting at your kitchen table and working with your staff, also working remotely, doing God's work during a very, very tenuous
As
time.
we all were.
Yeah. So, because it was so tenuous. I remember the months right after, kind of mid-April when all hell started to break loose. There was such uncertainty in the mortgage market for months that, ultimately subsided thanks to the work that you and others did within government. But it had to be a fascinating, something you'll always look back on as a really integral moment of your life.
So go ahead, Rich or Mark. Sorry.
No, I was gonna say I'm always torn in a way, in that there's a big part of me who just wants to forget 2020,
Right.
but as I'm sure many of us do. But it's important to kind of think about what went right and what went wrong.
Yeah. Well, we certainly have a changed world in terms of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the federal home loan banks. Fannie and Freddie have been allowed, obviously, to retain capital. Fannie's net worth, I think, is about 90 billion. Freddie Mac's is up to 56 billion. And back in 2019, you had done an interview where you were talking about risk-based capital. And, why should Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac be any different than any other large financial institution with some kind of minimum, say 4.5% risk-based capital? Are you still thinks that's the case, or do they have enough net worth now, do you think, to withstand a 2008 all over again? What are your thoughts on recent developments in terms of that?
So let's start, conceptually, and certainly a theme of my book is that, once you get sworn in and you decide to be a regulator, a lot of your opinions don't matter. Your job is to carry out the mission that Congress has given you. And so Congress very explicitly told FHFA, write a risk-based capital rule. Here are parameters that you need to keep in mind. And so, for instance, part of the debate happened at the time where there were a number of commentators who suggested that risk-based capital for the GSEs essentially be set, to kind of hit zero. Here's how much you think you're going to lose, set that much on the balance sheet. Now, setting aside that, to me, it's a questionable approach to begin with, but it's contrary to what Congress required. Congress required the companies to have positive going concern value. And what that ultimately means is that if you're in a stressed environment like 2008, that not only do you have capital to cover your losses, but you have capital to support doing new business. Because it's important to remind ourselves at the end of the day, fundamentally why Fannie and Freddie were created. They're created to kind of be, the firemen that come, when the crisis hits. They're created to be a forerunner of the market. And at the end of the day, if they're not strong in a crisis, then they can't be a forerunner of the market for the rest of the market. And so it's important to keep in mind that the whole concept of hitting zero is completely contrary to what actually Congress spelled out. So Congress spelled out, again, you cover the losses you expected and you have enough capital, maintain a going concern value. And this is ultimately an empirical question. In my view, where we ended up with the capital rule was reasonable, and if anything, probably on the bottom range of what you really want. Because what you want to make sure is that the market doesn't flee. And as a reminder, we saw this in 2008. We saw it in March 2020. When there's real distress in the marketplace, people move away from agency MBS and spreads widen. I mean, spreads blew out in March 2020. And so what you want is the opposite. You want to be able to have little movement in spreads, so that you can continue to support the market. And you want to have confidence in the marketplace. And unfortunately, to me, the status quo is 90% of the time in normal conditions, people kind of ignore the GSEs. And then when a crisis hits, you really see foreign investors particularly, but institutional investors, broker dealers start to ask, well, is this really guaranteed? I mean, what's there to protect me? And so to me, I quite frankly think we're maybe in the worst of all worlds where the current status quo ends up being very pro-cyclical, when again, what you want Fannie and Freddie to do is to be a counter-cyclical stability measure, and again, be a floor under the market. So that said, I don't expect major changes to the capital rule going forward. Maybe there were some tweaks in the Biden years. I suspect some of those tweaks will be undone, but by and large, I don't expect a new administration to revisit the capital rule. It'll largely stay the same. But to your maybe directly to your question, do I think they have enough capital on their books to withstand another 2008 scenario? Not yet, but they're moving in the right direction. They may be there in a year or two. If there is a silver lining to the pandemic, keep in mind about a fifth to a fourth of their book going into the pandemic was pre-2008. And the relevancy here is a lot of that book was priced at, say, 12 basis points G-fee. The silver lining of the pandemic was that book got completely repriced. So a very large part of the book was repriced for Fannie and Freddie. What it really means is they're in a really strong cash flow position today, and that allows them to continue to build capital at a pretty good rate. So to me, I'm glass half full guy. There's a light at the end of the tunnel. We are getting to where we need to be with the GSEs, and I think we're most of the way there.
Well, you brought up an interesting point that I wanted to ask you about, which is, for several years there was a lot of talk about GSE reforms. When are they going to be allowed to retain capital? When are they going to be privatized? Released from conservatorship and so forth. And I was wondering what your thoughts were. Not that I expect you to have a crystal ball, but you have a better insight into it than most. Where do you think GSE reform will be in terms of a new administration's agenda? Will it be kind of near the top? Will it be in the middle? Will it be an afterthought? I think there are some decision points coming up in the upcoming years with regard to agreements that may be in place with regard to the GSEs. So do you think the new administration will make GSE reform a priority?
Rob, I think I don't want to sound like a lawyer parsing words, but I will for a little bit, because a lot of people mean a lot of things by the word reform. So let's start with, is a legal matter. They never stop being private. Just as, when Hertz went into bankruptcy a few years ago, they didn't stop being a private company because they were in bankruptcy. When the government took over AIG did not stop being a private company. And so by law, and there's a tremendous amount of case law, if any lawyers out there want to, bore themselves to tears reading case law, court after court has said Fannie and Freddie are private companies. So what a conservatorship is really is an administrative bankruptcy, and being released from conservatorship, in my view, is not reform. It's simply what the existing, institutional legal structure expects. We didn't reform the banking system when Silicon Valley Bank failed and was bailed out and released. And that's the framework for Fannie and Freddie. So, but let me answer that question in terms of what I think you may have been asking, which is it a high likelihood that there will be a conservatorship exit, with or without structural changes to the system? I think it is highly likely. I give it about a 70-80% chance by 2027 that Fannie and Freddie come out of conservatorship. Certainly, there's a number of things you need to do. Obviously, 2025, the top line item for the administration is going to be tax reform. We're all interested in what's going to happen on the individual side. Certainly, none of us, I don't want my taxes to go up. So, I don't want those individual sided taxes to expire. There's a lot of debate about increasing the SALT deduction and things like that, which, may help. I think it's riches in California, so maybe that'll be a benefit to you. So there's some conversation there on tax, trade issues, obviously, China tariffs. These are going to dominate 2025. But that said, you can do a lot of work. As I mentioned earlier, it'll take you to June, July to get a new FHFA commissioner, director in. And I think so. It's got to be a slow start getting personnel. It really will require the Treasury Secretary as well to bring in personnel that have expertise in mortgage finance. We were quite lucky in some ways, if you remember. Not only, obviously Mnuchin was known for One West and the Indy Mac purchase, but he also was an MBS trader early in his career. You really had somebody. In fact, I'd go as far to say I can't think of a Treasury Secretary who had more mortgage and MBS experience than Mnuchin. The guy probably unparalleled in terms of his expertise in the mortgage market. You're not, even if it's Bessent, you don't have that kind of experience probably coming in. So, and you certainly don't have that experience with the current outgoing Treasury team, and that makes a big deal. So it does mean that whoever comes in as Treasury Secretary is going to need to staff out. And so these things are a process. So the one takeaway would be there's not going to be a conservatorship exit in 2025, but there's a likely exit by 2027. And then I want to close with a little bit of a topic on, could Congress come in and change the structure? And some of us are old enough to remember Corker Warner and Crapo Johnson and all of these attempts to essentially repaint the mortgage market. First of all, I think any attempt to just start with a white piece of paper and completely shut down the system and design it new from the bottom up, which is what Crapo Johnson was trying to do, that's dead. There's no chance. We're not going back to a wholesale rewriting and reconstruction of the mortgage market, but that's just off the table. So the question really, I think, fundamentally for those interested in the mortgage finance market, is Congress going to come in and create some sort of guarantee around agency MBS? And I think that's the parameters of the debate. Of course, there's an ongoing debate about, should things be done to the Federal Home Loan Banks as well? And I think at the end of the day, I think it's highly unlikely. Traditionally, Republicans have not shown as much interest in these topics. We have, Tim Scott will be the banking committee chair. We don't know yet who will be chairing House Financial Services. It will likely be French Hill or Andy Barr or Bill Huizinga, but that's yet to be parsed out. But it's a really difficult set of issues. And you're almost certain to upset somebody. And so the politics of it are very difficult. As you may recall, I worked on mortgage finance reform pretty much daily from 2003 to 2008, and it was hard. And it was hard politically is what I mean. And we would have never gotten it done had it not been for the 2008 crisis to do a push. So there's part of me that says, boy, it's kind of like, the conversation about 3% mortgage rates. I don't know that I want to have a world of 3% mortgage rates, because think about what needed to happen for us to get the 3% mortgage rates, really bad things like the pandemic. And it's the same thing for us to see wholesale mortgage finance reform means we're in a bad world. Yeah. So again, be careful what you wish for. Congress is not very good at, fixing things when, as I always say, the old JFK quote about, the time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining. unfortunately, that's not really how Washington works most of the time.
Right. Yeah, I would venture to say that anybody in our industry right now, if or I should say anybody in from some other planet or some other country, if you were to design a mortgage system from the ground up, it wouldn't look like ours. But then again, you know, you can't fix an airplane while it's flying, kind of
Absolutely.
thing. Otherwise, you run aground of all kinds of things. I would imagine that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, in their ranks, are doing all kinds of what if scenarios and doing all kinds of game theory calculations in terms of how this might play out. Uh,
The interesting wrinkle is, my impression is, the top third of the companies are probably really getting excited and celebrating and saying, we're going to get out. We're going to be like normal financial companies again. And then I think the bottom two-thirds of the companies are a little bit more like, I don't know. It's kind of comfortable the way it is. I'm not ready for some change. So I think there's a fair amount of debate within the companies, depending on who you talk to. But I think at the end of the day, I mean, for the foreseeable future, like it or not, we are going to have, a duopoly model of Fannie and Freddie that mostly looks like the status quo, with even with an exit from conservatorship. I mean, 85-90% of the status quo stays. So, I think the change exit out of a conservatorship would be quite modest. And again, we're not going to redesign the system, even if we perhaps should.
Yeah. The and you mentioned March 2020 when a lot of the non-QM, I won't say all the non-QM investors, but they backed out of the market entirely. They stopped taking locks. They didn't honor existing locks, and you know, if we were interviewing somebody from one of those companies now, I wouldn't be afraid to say what I just said, because truly there was chaos in, and you could say, well, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they were always there. They weren't necessarily running for the hills. They stood there. I mean, they took their share of locks. And then eventually the non-QM investors came in. So you wouldn't want a situation if and when they're released from conservatorship and fully privatized. But to your point, they are private companies, but if they're released from conservatorship, you wouldn't want them in a situation where they felt like they had to run in case of a March 2020 scenario, of course.
And there are a couple of things. I mean, first, let's keep in mind, in this is a lot of post Dodd-Frank capital rules on broker dealers. So part of the problem, in the mortgage finance space in March 2020 was, you saw a lot of foreign investors. So foreign investors started in about November, December. I mean, if you go back, it's fascinating. They were very clearly concerns about the pandemic as early as November, even though we all kind of associate it with, say, March, and the first US case wasn't until January 2020. Global investors were moving into safer assets starting in November, December, and January, and that benefited agency MBS. And then you started getting into February, March, and there was an abandonment of agency MBS. And then when the Fed started lowering rates, inverted the yield curve, clobbered MSR values, if we remember that, which clobbered mortgage REITs. And so you saw international investors at the same time dumping MBS, at the same time that mortgage REITs were having to dump agency MBS to cover their losses on their MSRs. And then because of the Dodd-Frank capital rules, the broker dealers who normally hold a lot of MBS inventory also hit the wall. And the point being, all of this was basically saved by the Federal Reserve saying, we'll buy all that MBS. And so now, of course, in the pre-conservatorship days, Fannie and Freddie, and we can debate to the extent of this was true, but they played a quasi market maker role in their own debt. They would see the spreads widen between their unsecured debt and the MBS, and they would go out and buy MBS for their balance sheets. Obviously, in conservatorship, they've had caps on their balance sheet activity. They have not been the swing buyer, if you will, for their own debt. And instead, that role has been taken by the Federal Reserve. And I think it is important to keep in mind, we came through avoiding a real shutdown in the agency MBS market because of the Fed. Now, I'm not happy with that. I think that's a bad outcome. I think it saved us from a worse outcome, but I think it does remind us that if the system only works because the Fed comes in and prints money and covers up everything, then perhaps there's some cracks in the system that we need to think through. So it's just something where there's a lot of fragility. So, for instance, to me, mortgage REITs are a source of fragility right now. A lot of them, again, they're funding overnight, holding MBS and MSRs, which to me is a risky proposition. Fortunately, there's not a large number of them. The broker dealers and agency MBS are highly concentrated, like 10 or 90% of the market. So the point being, you have a lot of bottlenecks in the capital market side of the mortgage finance system, where if a small number of players hit the wall in terms of balance sheet capacity, it ripples through the rest of the market. So again, normal every day today doesn't really matter, but in a stressed environment, this could really come back to haunt us.
This is The Big Picture. I'm Rich Swerbinsky with Onward and Upward Consulting, joined as always by Rob Chrisman. This week's special guest, former FHFA Director Mark Calabria. And I want to thank our new show sponsor, Gaffney Austin. You can check them out at gaffneyaustin.com. They are a phenomenal marketing and PR firm focused on the mortgage lending industry. If you need help with strategic communication, public relations, give them a check it out at gaffneyaustin.com. So thanks again to Gaffney Austin. And
Rich, do you think they would be interested in handling the sports card business?
that's a fun business to market, but probably not as lucrative as the mortgage industry. So
True.
yeah.
True.
Not as liquid.
Right. So much there, so insightful, so much more that you laid out there that I'd like to dig into a little bit more. One, guarantee fees. It's caught a lot of attention in the mortgage industry, just the challenge on affordability, obviously. I've also just heard from some lender clients of mine that they've been raised again, kind of without warning. That annually, FHFA used to put out a report on what guarantee fees are. There hasn't been one of those since 2022. That's been done. Most suspect they're somewhere between 65 and 70 basis points. You mentioned earlier, former book that was kind of rewritten 12. I remember them being 15 to 18, a lot of my career in capital markets. If you could, I guess just talk about guarantee fees for a moment. They've risen a lot. I guess one, is there any chance that guarantee fees are ever lowered as a mechanism to help with affordability? And
Certainly some of that could change. And let me say, we talked a little bit about Rob and I just now about the exit from conservatorship. And one of the reasons that, I think it's important to get out of conservatorship is to just depoliticize the guarantee fee LLPAs. It's we didn't take this approach. The only change I ever made to the guarantee fees was the adverse market fee that we needed to keep Fannie and Freddie afloat during the pandemic. And you've really seen an approach in recent years to politicize it. So to really create cross subsidies where, okay, we're going to charge higher quality borrowers higher G fees so that we can charge lower quality borrowers lower G fees. And so there really is an attempt by the outgoing administration to reduce risk-based pricing in the mortgage market and to target certain cuts to favored constituencies and pay for it. So I guess on one hand, I credit them for trying to make it all budget neutral so that they're at least paying for the subsidies with fees otherwise. But at the end of the day, I really think we need to get this to a place where it's not the political system deciding what G fees are, but it's ultimately commercial business decisions by Fannie and Freddie independently. Like there's just no reason, the GSEs are still under our antitrust laws. I don't generally think of duopolies as a positive. And so to me, having some independent pricing power between the companies and having some pricing power, or rather pricing decisions driven by business needs and economics rather than politics. So let me just say that's one reason. And I don't really think it's good for the industry if you're in a situation where every 4 years the G fees change because of the politics. You really want to get out of that. You see it at FHA where there's always a discussion back or forth whether the mortgage insurance premium should change based on who's HUD secretary. And again, I don't ultimately think that that's healthy. So I do think that you could have a possibility in a new administration. It's not going to happen day one. As I mentioned, you'll see direct acting people where you start to see some reversal of the increase for higher quality borrowers and the decrease where you get back to a little bit more normal pricing of risk within the G fees. I don't think we should expect it to be a lot. I don't think we should expect it to be right away. I think it's also important to keep in mind, since the fundamental problem is in the housing market or ultimately supply, it is important to keep in mind that G fees act through the demand side of the market. So there certainly is, you could disagree with it or not, but a perspective in Washington that significant increases in the G fees would simply just allow borrowers to bid up the house price more. And if you're not fixing house price supply, you aren't really changing the affordability equation. So while I could see some changes in the G fees, both for, undoing some of the things that have been done recently, and I think there's a real commitment to try to give the industry more notice. I mean, obviously some emergency situations may dictate a little bit more, but trying to give the industry at least say 2 months notice for changes. But I don't think you're going to see in the new administration take the approach that changes in G fee are really going to say fix the affordability problems that are fundamentally supply driven.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
think Mark, you brought that up. It was almost as if, oh, it's Thursday, so let's raise the G fees. You know, the I think the industry understands why why G fee changes take place. They would just like some warning.
Yeah, I agree.
You have a locked pipeline that you can't hedge a change in G fees that comes out of nowhere.
Rob, I could guarantee you when we rolled out the adverse market fee, I heard from a lot of people about the pipeline risk, and we ultimately delayed that to deal with the pipeline risk. And there's certainly a awareness of that. Now, the tension during the pandemic was, we were burning money pretty quickly, and we also didn't want to miss, the refi boom that was going on. But certainly, I think you're going to see normal course of business is going to be to give the industry at least 60 days. Now, there may again be some emergency situations, which we hope we're never in, but I think you should expect a minimum of a 60, even as much as a 90, 120-day notice, going forward.
Now you may remember this better than I do. Hopefully you do. But back in 2010 or 2012, there was it a 10 basis point fee
Over
that
the Congress put on there to pay for,
uh,
and
I think
there's currently one, they replaced it again with a 5 basis point fee. So, yes, the budget deal there was a 10 basis point fee added. And at that time, I believe it was both Fannie, Freddie, and FHA. And the FHA one eventually went away. And then I believe it was 2019, maybe, where Congress reimposed a 5 basis point. That's still there. I'd have to go back and look. And that is supposed to roll off at some point. I want to say 26, but I don't remember specifically the year.
I thought I wasn't like some highway.
Yep, yeah, it was no, G fees went up to pay for highways. So I'm not a fan of that. If you're wondering, I objected to it during the time. And this is another risk of the conservatorship, is because that was done during the conservatorship. It was renewed in a smaller amount during the conservatorship. And you really run the risk because, as you and I kind of talked about a little bit earlier, Rob, to what degree are they private because of the conservatorship? And the risk of the conservatorship is Congress continues to see these companies as potential cash cows. So again, if you're out of conservatorship, the likelihood that Congress not puts on add-on G fees to pay for highways is reduced outside of a conservatorship. As long as they're in conservatorship, you always run that risk that when someone's trying to make the numbers work on something, they're going to say, oh, well, let's just tack on a few points of G fees.
Right. Is there, and once again, I apologize for having a faulty memory here.
No, I mean, I can't remember all this myself sometimes.
Is the adverse market fee still in place?
Yeah, that's gone away. And again, it was only targeted to pay for, the COVID losses to Fannie and Freddie were in the neighborhood of 7 to 8 billion. For instance, every servicer got paid an additional $500 for exits from the exit from forbearance. That was about $1 billion that needed to be raised. There were about 200,000 families in advanced state of foreclosure when the pandemic hit. And, obviously these were families that were already, ready to be evicted, if you will, and foreclosed upon. And we really felt that given the pandemic and not wanting to put people on the street in the pandemic, we paid their mortgage, we paid their property taxes, and that added up. So it's just to say, I don't regret any of the decisions that we had to pay for. And in fact, I recognize the mortgage industry might not have been happy about it because, again, let's go back to the G fee for transportation. I think the transportation system should pay for the transportation system. And
Sure.
by extension, I think the mortgage system should pay for the mortgage system. And so the fact that we managed to pay for the assistance that was provided during COVID, I think that was the right thing to do, rather than hit the taxpayer up overall. But yes, eventually the adverse market fee went away. And again, I'm just, to me, I think it was the right thing that we did not hit the taxpayer, in that when we kept people in their homes and we provided forbearance and we provided additional funding to servicers, that all of that was paid for within the system.
Yeah, I certainly agree with your statement that the mortgage, in this case, the transportation system should pay for its own whatever. And if Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are released from conservatorship, Congress will be less inclined or maybe prohibited
Yeah,
from accessing their cash flow.
it's certainly less justifiable, so again, that's another reason. And again, 100%, the longer they stay in the conservatorship, the increased likelihood that Congress just adds on additional fees.
Mark,
Yeah.
the federal home loan bank system also falls under FHFA
Yep.
purview. And about a year ago, FHFA put a report out after a lot of studying them, and it basically, nutshell, said they weren't probably fully living up to their charter and needed to take maybe a little bit of the lift off of Fannie and Freddie. Your thoughts just on the federal home loan bank system in general, and we could possibly see happen with them over the next 3-4 years?
Well, let me start with the back of that question because it's the easiest part to answer. I think it's highly unlikely that. So Congress is not going to come in. I know Senator Cortez Masto had a bill, and there have been conversations about, doubling the affordable housing contributions from 10 to 20%. And there's a lot of debate about, who should be members and should membership be expanded to non-banks, which only Congress can do. I just don't see any appetite for Congress to deal with federal home loan bank issues. So to me, maybe a 10% at best chance that Congress opens up the federal home loan bank system. I think it's largely going to stay as it is. Now, I think there is a fair amount of debate. Why do you have the federal home loan bank system? What does it do? And first of all, I'll say why I have some issue with some of the language and recommendations in the report. It's a good history lesson. So for those who don't have a tremendous familiarity with it, reading the report's a good starting point. A lot of debate over, should the Federal Home Loan Bank system be a lender of last resort like the Fed? And of course, that's why it was created. It's also worth saying the statute, the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, it's just a lot messier and ambiguous. Fannie and Freddie, we've got the charters. They're fairly extensive. I might complain that sometimes parts of them are ignored. But it's on paper. Any of us can, you can go to the website, read the charters if you want. You don't have the same sort of specificity with the federal home loan banks. And I think that's where a lot of the debate is about. And there were some proposals, but my guess is at the end of the day, I think the whole topic of federal home loan bank reform just dies over the next year. There'll still be some, a lot of debate about how much should the system be dominated by the largest banks. As like Chase, Wells, these guys are the big users of the system. And ultimately, the system really was created to help small community institutions, community banks. And how much can you have that kind of expand? Those are all important questions, but I'd be shocked if anything comes out of this at this point.
And then on a release from conservatorship, you do a great job laying out the case for it and the politicization of G fees and other things that administration to administration change. The flip side of that is the mortgage market worries about
Sure.
The shock to the market, destabilizing the housing market, rate rises to interest rates. You had spoken a little bit about some of the things you were working on when you were director, building a capital stack that could help mitigate that. If you could just follow up on that a little bit, because it was something we got some follow-up questions from our audience on.
It's a great question, and I know, and I hear often sort of concerns. Sometimes people characterize the execution risk. How's this going to be pulled off? So let's parse out a couple of things. And it's certainly worth reminding people. We have, as a country, done large corporate reorganizations before. AIG might be the best example of something fairly similar. But I would argue that the primary difference for Fannie and Freddie is really size rather than complexity. So, for instance, unlike AIG, where units of the company were sold off, or other large corporate reorganizations like the railroads, which we've reorganized so many times, or the auto companies, at the end of the day, an exit from conservatorship is not going to have any change at all to the asset side of the balance sheet for Fannie and Freddie, nor is it going to change the operational ability. You as a lender can still bring a pool of MBS and a pool of loans and swap them for MBS. You as a lender can still go to the cash window. None of that changes. And so no businesses are being spun off. No assets are being sold or anything like that. So I do want to emphasize first and foremost, this is actually relatively easy conceptually as a corporate organization. But let's move to the liability side of the balance sheet, because that's where the action is, and that's where the fun is, if you will. So certainly the primary thing you're going to see in an exit from conservatorship is a restructuring liability side of the balance sheet. Some of that will be a write-down of the government's investment to reflect mark-to-market values, but more importantly on the debt side. So as a reminder, because I think there's a tremendous amount of confusion in the conversations out there, there's nothing about the conservatorship that creates an explicit guarantee. The GSEs are not guaranteed today. Debt holders have no legal claim on the taxpayer today. And I think conceptually, the best way to think about it is, rather than think about the implied guarantee, so we've left the explicit guarantee conversation like Ginny, and we've moved over to an implied guarantee conversation, and so rather than think of an implied guarantee as a light switch, 0, 1, to me, I think the best way to conceptualize this is to think about it as a probability. What is the probability that the taxpayer will put a floor under MBS prices and make creditors whole. Today, it's not 100%. It's not 0 either. It's probably closer to 75. So let's, for the sake of numbers, which these numbers are going to be off, but this is just something to help the conversation conceptualize. Let's say today in conservatorship that being in conservatorship means there's a 75% chance that creditors are taken care of in an insolvency. Obviously, that affects the rate at which creditors are willing to lend to Fannie and Freddie. Let's say an exit from conservatorship reduces that probability from 75 to 45. Again, these are just illustrative numbers. It's going to be, fuzzy around these probabilities. And so what does that mean? That means, yes, it's possible that creditors will charge slightly more. I don't see any reason to believe that creditors would abandon the agency market. So there's two margins here. The margin is yes, no, will I buy an agency MBS? And then the other margin is, how much am I going to pay for it? I think it's pretty clear, a lot of banks, hold agency MBS, a lot of foreign investors, a lot of asset managers. It's a huge, second only to treasuries in terms of the footprint. So it's just too large of a market for a lot of investors not to be in, quite frankly. And so I think at the end of the day, the question of will investors stay in this market, to me, is clearly yes. And then the more important question is, will the pricing change? And then
what yield will they demand?
Exactly. And so let's say you do move from, say, a 75% probability of guarantee to 45% probability. So, that could be 10 basis points, 15 basis points. So I do think to scope this, it's hard for me to imagine worst case scenario of, let's say, 20 basis points, 25. I think that's the range of a worst case scenario. By reference, since I left FHFA, the spread has increased 50 basis points. So, to some extent, we've seen the worst. It hasn't been good, but we have an experience with how bad it can be. Now, what can you do to offset that is part of the question. So that's where I think the more important conversation comes in. So for those of us who want to go back to our graduate finance classes, might remember Modigliani-Miller theorem, which basically argues and shows empirically that the more highly leveraged you are, the more you pay to borrow, which of course is not a mystery. If you have less cushion in front of investors. And ultimately, what drives mortgage prices to the borrower is going to be those spreads on the MBS. And one way to reduce those MBS spreads is to increase capital that stands in front of the MBS. And that's kind of what we were trying to achieve, accepting that Congress looked like it was in no way going to provide a guarantee. And Secretary Mnuchin and I spent a lot of time on the Hill trying to get Congress there. It didn't happen, and I think it's unlikely to happen. So if you can't get Congress to do that, what do? You try to build a lot in front of the MBS is one. And as I mentioned last time, our goal was, 4% equity, 4% unsecured bailable debt that gave you 8% on the capital stack in front of the MBS. And then the attempt was to improve the credit quality. So on one hand, and it was always pleasant surprise to me, pleasant recognition as FHFA director, how much of Fannie and Freddie's book was rock solid. Probably 80% of their book, there could be an asteroid hit the planet and those loans are going to pay. But you got about a 5%, even as much as 6 or 7%, that's got a lot of problems: high DTI, low FICO, really high LTVs. And some of that does enter the spreads because it increases servicing costs, it increases delinquency costs. And so to me, if you can modest changes to the credit box that get rid of, say, the worst 5%, and you keep the rest, the 95%, I think you can modestly bring down some of those spreads. Obviously, some of the current spreads are prepayment risk, and that's going to moderate as rates start to come down. So if we get inflation under control, which is headed that way, rates should start to come down. As rates come down, it's got to be almost a virtuous cycle of where prepayment risk moderates a little bit, and also those rates come down. So the question is, mechanically, I think this is all completely doable. Is there some degree of risk with it? Sure. Nothing in life is risk-free. Status quo is risky. Any way to move away from the status quo is risky. But I would emphasize the way we were doing this before, really was just kind of like as you cross a river and you try to move your foot one stone at a time, and you don't ever have, you're always standing somewhere. It's the same kind of way. We're going to try to make sure if this happens, I think any administration, this is certainly the way we were doing it, was going to do this a step at a time, very cautiously, and try to make sure this incredible support. And while, of course, you can't really get a commitment out of the Federal Reserve, I do think if you're an MBS investor or you're in the mortgage market, I think there's a very high probability that if Fannie and Freddie are exited from conservatorship and that there are disruptions in the agency MBS market, that the Fed will be back in the market buying and putting a floor under it.
Interesting.
Interesting.
For good or bad, I just think as a predictive, I think that's almost certainly the case if there are disruptions in the MBS market.
Interesting. Excellent. Well, as always, Mark, very insightful conversation. Appreciate it. We had a couple questions in the chat. One about GSE shareholders treated differently than FDIC bank shareholders as private companies.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, to me, I've written about this, I've complained about this, and we tried to fix this when I was there, and obviously ran out of time, and I inherited the situation I inherited. But really, I guess I should take a step back and say, when we crafted the resolution framework, which includes conservatorship and receivership for Fannie and Freddie, we literally picked up the Federal Deposit Insurance Act, sections 13 and 11, for those of you who are interested, and plagiarized it. We made an intentional decision to say we wanted GSE resolution to be within the body of law, including the case law around FDIC. It's not as if we agreed with everything in that case law, but it had decades and decades of precedent that had been worked out. So again, you get these conversations about, well, what about execution risk? How would this work? We intentionally said, well, we're gonna answer all that questions by taking framework elsewhere where it has worked. So to me, the big problem throughout the years is, not only, and put it this way, in 2008, when we were writing this language, nobody thought a conservatorship would go longer than 6 months. We certainly didn't think 16 years. And there has been tremendous amount of deviation by the agency over the years from, that FDIC framework, which was supposed to be the roadmap. So yes, I share the frustration and I share the agreement that this did not work how Congress intended it to.
And then non-owner occupied properties, not really, within the GSE kind of charter spirit. I mean, the question is, would they go back to maybe capping it, or right now they've.
I think there's a likelihood that that would be reviewed, and so there's a couple of wrinkles. First, let me say, that came from Treasury as a request in March 2020. And you should think about the PSPAs, the share agreements that Treasury provides as a letter of credit is, like debt covenants. And it's not unusual in a firm in bankruptcy when someone to lend them money to have a bunch of covenants that restrict risk. That's actually the norm in corporate reorganizations. And so the Treasury perspective was, we're an investor here. We're keeping this afloat. We want you to reduce risk A, B, C, and D. And so the investor cap was a Treasury request. And we were comfortable with it because we needed Treasury's agreement, and everybody gives up a little bit. And as importantly, we felt as leveraged as the companies were, that you had to make choices about what business you could support with the capital you had. And the fact that we really looked at it and said, the second home investor business isn't core. I still think it's honestly a bit nutty as a public policy issue that, at that time you could have 12 loans with Fannie Mae. I mean, I understand that from the business perspective or an investor perspective, but what's the public policy perspective? And so again, I would expect there to be some additional scrutiny of the investor side. And again, with the supply constraints in this market, that has kind of put competition with homeowners. So, again, it's funny because everybody wants to kind of knock on, Invitation Homes or somebody for, driving up prices in Phoenix. But, Fannie and Freddie's funding of investors has actually been a bigger competitor with homeowners. Now, ultimately, exiting from conservatorship, they would be allowed to get back in the investor market in a larger way. And this would really be an interim. And it's important to keep in mind, many of the restrictions in the PSPAs go away post-conservatorship. So a benefit of being out of conservatorship is you do have the companies going back to some of the flexibility they had between conservatorship.
Excellent. And my good friend Brendan Weiss just relinked your book in the chat. So check out Mark's book and consider picking it up. And we will.
And we are out of time.
And we are out of time. But I want to thank, and Lisa, this is being recorded. This goes immediately to podcast and YouTube, probably about 15 minutes from now. So you can check out the recording there. And I want to thank our special guest, Mark Calabria, former FHFA Director, for joining us once again. Mark, really appreciate it.
Rob, my pleasure.
And I want to thank Rob, as always, and our special sponsor, Gaffney Austin, a marketing and public relations firm for the mortgage industry. Check them out at gaffneyaustin.com. And
absolutely.
Yeah, and we'll be sending this again to podcast and YouTube shortly here. But I want to thank all of you for spending some time with us. We'll be back next Thursday at 3 Eastern, and have a great rest of your week and weekend, everyone.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Rich.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Gaffney Austin.